everyone. This is Tom Fox. Gilbert and Andrew are on assignment today, so I'm going to take a solo turn behind the mic for this week's Kerrville Weekly News. We had quite the crime week in Kerrville. As reported by the Kerrville Daily Times, police arrest 2 suspects in the alleged ATM heist at Wells Fargo, and they identified the suspect in the carjacking case. So if you be careful out there. Next up, for the Paiz classes of 1956, 1957, and 1958 are coming together for a reunion on November 1. So just to show that Paiz fight never dies, the reunions will be at Mamacita's restaurant, and you have to RSVP for these. So I hope if you're a Paiz high school class grad from one of those years, you'll attend the reunion. Next up, we had quite an interesting week at the Commissioners Court as Ann Ballou was sworn in to take the seat vacated by Harley Ballou after he was found that he had a criminal conviction and could not stand for election. Ballou was removed September 29th after having been deemed ineligible to serve in public office by State District Judge Sid Harrell. The controversy over Overby's appointment stemmed from the fact that Ballou had until October 19th to file his appeal. The Kerrville was honored with a music-friendly Texas community designation by the Texas Music Office. This was the 50th such designation given by the Governor's Office of Economic Development and Tourism, and it promotes growth and development in various sectors of the Texas music industry. Obviously, Kerrville music and Kerrville are almost synonymous, whether you think of the vibrant music scene in Kerrville, the numerous venues, small, intimate, and fabulous venues, and, of course, the Kerrville Folk Festival. So this year, this designation is really something that everyone in Kerrville should be proud of. Next up, if you don't read Joe Herring's column, you really should. He is a true treasure coming to our town every week with his weekly column of Around Town. And this week he writes about soldiers who died in service of our country who now have streets named for them in Kerrville. And that's, Sidney Baker obviously is well known, and Pete Castillo is the one he writes about. So a really interesting article by Joe Herring. Next up, Playhouse 2000 announces its new season. If you enjoy theater in Kerrville, and I certainly do, I hope you will check out some of the plays slated for production in 2024. They are going to include, of course, Shakespeare in the Park, one of my personal favorites, Brigadoon, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. So if you enjoyed theater, and who doesn't, I would urge you to check out Playhouse 2000. And our final story is about the Kerrville City Council having its regularly scheduled meeting this week. And during this meeting, the council approved an interlocal agreement with Kerr County to improve the Al Mooney Road from the intersection of Peterson Farm to Memorial Boulevard. But also, and probably of greater interest, is the concerns around the Lennar subdivision that may go in the location of the former middle school. There was an agreement between the Economic Development Grant and Lennar that was on the agenda for City Council, but that's been pushed to November 14th. As part of the push, it's supposed to have TRZ discussion on this. So The fire chief reported on the annular eclipse, which occurred on October 14th. He said we had a population increase of about 10 to 15%, and numbers were lower than typically experienced on the 4th of July with no traffic impact. There were a few issues that he said needed to be improved, and they're going to take those into account for the full lunar eclipse, which will occur next April. In a couple of pronouncements, the city secretary was nominated for Texas Municipal Clerk of the Year award. The mayor proclaimed November 6th through 10 as a municipal court week in Kerrville. And our final story comes to us from Louis Amstoy over at The Lead, who reports that Kerrville and Kerr County Airport face lawsuits in the fatal drag race crash from a couple of years ago. The families of two of the three people have filed suit in the 198th District Court, and they seek damages for the death of Rebecca Cedillo and Santiago Martinez. The drag race was a terrible tragedy. The lawsuit alleges the city, the airport, and the promoter were all negligent in allowing the race to continue and by not ensuring safe locations for spectators, enabling a drag race to happen on a surface not suited for the event, and not enforcing safety measures, including the use of barriers beyond the finish line after and in the shutdown area. The plaintiffs are attempting to get the court to waive Kerrville's sovereign immunity because this was an ultra-hazardous activity. Getting money out of the city and airport could be limited to $250,000, but if they're able to get out of the sovereign immunity, it could be considerably high. So those are some of the top stories we followed this week on the Kerrville Weekly News. I hope you will join us again next week for another edition. This is Tom Fox. I hope you enjoyed this edition of the Kerrville Weekly News Roundup. This podcast is a production of the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you will subscribe or rate and review this podcast wherever great podcasts are listened to. I hope you will join Gilbert, Andrew, and myself next week where we take a look at some of the top stories from Kerrville and the surrounding Hill Country area. Thanks so much for listening. This is Tom Fox. Thank you so much for listening to the inaugural episode of the Kerrville Weekly News Roundup. This podcast is a special production of the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. We now have 10 podcasts on the network, so I hope you will check out the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network and listen, rate, and review to some or all of the podcasts. We are the only podcast network in the Hill Country, and we're bringing a wide variety of topics to you for your entertainment and enjoyment. If you've got a podcast or you'd like to consider starting a podcast, please give us a shout. There's a link to contact us on the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network, or you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you so much for listening to this episode.